I am Kevin Klein, and this is Inside Winnipeg Politics. Today, we are joined by political science professor Royce Koop, as we always are, and a Winnipeg Sun columnist. Also, we're joined by Jeff Currier, who is a Winnipeg Sun columnist, but not a professor of political science. And
No,
neither
I am
am
not.
I. And neither am I, Kevin Klein, the host, I guess. So today we got a number of topics we're going to talk about and break it into segments for you. The first one we want to talk about is the deficit, the Canadian deficit, because I noticed that nobody is really talking about the Canadian deficit. And of course, Jeff, you brought this one up. So share your thoughts with us on that.
Well, what happened when the so-called fall economic statement was released? The politics really kind of overshadowed the arithmetic, which is unfortunate. Typically, the fall economic statement is issued in October, maybe in November. This government kicked it down to really just before Christmas, well into December, so much later than usual. And what had happened, what had transpired, of course, with our then finance minister, Chrystia Freeland, resigning just hours before she was to have tabled this in the Commons, it came reflected back to a couple of days earlier when the prime minister made it clear that she was going to be moved out of the finance portfolio after the tabling of this fall economic statement. And I think she was not prepared to suffer that kind of humiliation. So she resigned. And I think that's all been well documented. And it overshadowed, all of the politics overshadowed some of the really interesting numbers in this fall economic statement. Initially, Freeland had promised back in the fall that the deficit was going to be about $40 billion, which is pretty significant anyway. Well, it turns out that it is just under $62 billion. That's our deficit this year. Yeah. So the national debt is skyrocketing. And in his fall economic statement, our parliamentary budget officer, Yves Giroux, predicted that by the end of the decade that our federal debt would be about $1.4 trillion. Well, that's now going to be closer to $1.6 trillion by the end of the decade. So, I mean, these are huge numbers, and it's hard for Canadians, hard for any of us to comprehend what these numbers mean. But currently, our Canadians spend $54 billion a year on nothing. That's the cost of paying interest on our national debt. You could buy 4 of our national dental care programs for what we spend on servicing the interest on our debt.
So,
Just to give you a little context.
Yeah, right. So what are your thoughts on that? Did Chris?
By the end of the decade,
sorry.
that number is going to balloon from $54 billion to closer to $69 billion that we're going to spend every year and get nothing for it.
Interest.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, governments they can manage debt more effectively than companies or private citizens like us. I don't want to kind of lose my mind every time the government runs a deficit. Sometimes it's a good idea to run a deficit. The problem is that the deficit is high and the debt is getting very high. And I think one thing that worries me is that it's been a very long time since Canadians actually experienced a genuine debt crisis. You have to go all the way back to the 1990s when Jean Chrétien was the prime minister and Paul Martin was the finance minister to see real austerity in response to debt, to the threat of downgrading our debt.
Yeah, and Royce, if I could just jump in, our debt at that time was about a third of what it is today.
Yeah. Yeah. So this situation where the cost of servicing our debt spirals out of control, there has to be spending cuts, program cuts, tax increases to manage this situation. I think Canadians have forgotten what that's like. And they don't really see the cost of these very high debt numbers. I'm concerned about this moving forward as well. They are much higher than they should be.
Well, where's the sustainability in that, right? I mean, we're not a massive nation with hundreds of millions of people. We're not the United States. If we're going to have a 1 trillion plus debt, that yes, we're paying all of this interest on to service it, which could go up in time. Those rates could go up, and we
Yeah.
could be paying more. When are people? Because really, we're the ones that are electing these people. When are we going to realize that we have to put somebody in there who's going to make the tough decisions? Because if you look at all the spending that's happened at every level, municipal, provincial, federal, nobody. I have not seen one person try to make any type of cut whatsoever. Not
Well,
one.
yeah, Royce, what do you think about this? Because you mentioned the Krejcik Paul Martin era. That was the last time Canadians had any kind of an appetite for reducing the national debt. What's happened in the last 30 years that as Kevin just alluded to, that we don't have any appetite for that kind of fiscal accountability?
Well, I think people have forgotten what it's like to face an actual crisis related to debt and deficit. And we live in a democracy. Politicians are going to do what the people want. And if people want more programs, more spending, and they're not worried about the debt, then no politician is going to come in with a an austerity budget and lose votes. I mean, even here in Manitoba, the PCs were spending like crazy in the last year of their time in office. Sorry, Kevin, I don't want to drag
I
you into this,
agree.
but
Listen, I agree, and I was the one in the room shaking my head. I had no idea why we were doing it. You could see the trajectory that we were on, and I disagreed with it. So you don't have to apologize.
But I think Jeff put his finger on the thing that actually I think does resonate with Canadians, the cost of servicing the debt. That is just genuinely money that we're flushing down the toilet. It's a real tragedy when we have programs that are underfunded, taxes that are too high. Just burning that money is an absolute tragedy. I think Canadians can understand that, and that is something that can lead to politicians actually making the argument for bringing the deficit down.
Well, it's a good point, and we'll leave it there because that's going to take us into our next topic here, and our next topic will be the gas tax and it coming back to Manitoba.